Now you might be thinking, Miss Cortez, we haven't looked at any architecture yet. What, uh, what an astute observation, student. You're right. We haven't looked at any architecture for Romanticism yet, but we are now. What? The next artwork is this massive structure. This is the Houses of Parliament in London, and they were designed by two architects, Charles Barry and A.W.N. Pugin. Now, the two men were put to the task of building the Houses of Parliament after the original Houses of Parliament had been destroyed in a very tragic fire. They were built in and we'll look at that fire, we'll talk about it a little bit more. The Houses of Parliament were built in a period style that is part of the Romantic movement, but also defined as the Gothic Revival. And that is your definition up there. The Gothic Revival is the renewed interest in Gothic architecture during the 19th century. I introduced the term Gothic Revival here with this artwork because it's a beautiful example of it, but I don't want you to limit yourself to thinking that this is the only example of it. Gothic Revival is an architectural style in which the architects are, romanticizing the medieval art and architecture of the Gothic period, which was from 1140-ish to like 1250-ish. That's the period in which the Gothic art and architecture really thrives. So Gothic Revival is people of the 19th century looking back at that and then using some of those architectural elements in the buildings that they're creating now. Gothic Revival is everywhere. We see it all the time, but I'm introducing it to you with the Houses of Parliament. That it? Okay. Here's an up-close view. The reason we refer to this as Gothic Revival is because it has an emphasis on verticality, vertical line work that is similar to what we see in, our actual original Gothic churches and structures. These spires here, these pinnacles, are very typical of Gothic architecture. In fact, the English love Gothic architecture, so much so that it's seen as almost like a national style. It's interesting to note that many people in various countries during the 19th century used Gothic Revival as a way to claim their own historical past, because Gothic as a medieval art and period style was so prevalent across so many different countries, France and the German nations and Spain and England. So when they look at their past and they see their medieval Gothic structures, it is a part of their national identity. So the Gothic Revival isn't just looking to the past at the styles, but it's almost like calling back the greatness of your national history. It's patriotism in some way. This here is Westminster Abbey, which is just down the road from the Houses of Parliament, and it was built during the Gothic period. Do we have another image here? We'll come back to it. Here, this is Salisbury Cathedral, and it's in Salisbury, England. And what we see is the characteristics of the English Gothic. We have that line work going up, right? Oh, let me move out of the way. There. So we see the line work going up, right? That's that verticality I was telling you about. Also, English Gothic has these dominant horizontal bands, almost like step ladders that rise up the structure. And so we see that here in English Gothic and being used again in the Gothic Revival. See those spires at the top? Spires at the top. So Barry and Pugin are designing the Houses of Parliament very specifically to look like English Gothic, a point of national identity and national pride. Just to kind of drive home the point. Here again, we see verticality and those horizontal bands of the English Gothic. Now, I mentioned Westminster Abbey, which is this one here. This one here. Let's look at it. Let's go stand over here and look at it from the front. Here it is. I said that it's just down the road from the Houses of Parliament. Yeah, like literally. So there's the river back here, and then here's the Houses of Parliament, and you just come up the street, and boom, there's Westminster Abbey. Westminster Abbey, built during the Gothic period, it is also a source of national identity for the English people because every single monarch has been crowned here at this abbey. Every single monarch of the English throne has been crowned here at this abbey. I know, right? It's crazy. So the visual resemblance to Westminster Abbey adds some sense of connection with the past. Now, Miss Cortez, you said that they built this because the original houses were burnt. Yeah, here is a drawing of the old Houses of Parliament. They had been built in the 11th century with the establishment of the parliamentary government, and they were destroyed by a fire in 1834. They were, by the time of the 1830s, kind of old and dusty and crusty. They were not big enough to accommodate the houses. They were falling apart, and not because of disuse, but simply because they were 800 years old. And sadly, a fire broke out in one of the houses in 1834. Now, the fire destroyed the entire parliamentary complex. Here is a nice view of the old Parliament houses. So here's Westminster Abbey, there's the river, and this here is the old Houses of Parliament. And the fire just went right through, and it was awful. Here is a painting by Turner depicting that moment, the night in which the houses burned. Obviously, people tried to stop the blaze and stop its spread, but many of the most of the people of London just watched in horror and felt helpless. It was documented that people lined the bridges along the Thames River and along the bank, just crying and weeping in sorrow as the houses burned. And you might be asking, crying, weeping? Why are they crying and weeping? This is literally their seat of government. It's as if we watch the Capitol building burn. It is a point of national identity that you're watching being destroyed. After the Houses of Parliament were burned down, they needed to rebuild. And this rebuild needed to happen with intention. There was a contest, and they welcomed submissions from various people to propose their new Houses of Parliament. Barry and Pugin won with their Gothic revival style because it was a callback to, here I'm pointing at Westminster Abbey again, it was a callback to English national identity. Barry had been well educated, and he had traveled extensively in not only Europe, but he had traveled to Greece and Turkey and Palestine. Pugin was an advocate for the Gothic style, and he even wrote a book called The True Principles of Christian Architecture. Now, I mentioned their education and experience and their intentions because we can see that play out in their submission for the Houses of Parliament. Because Barry was so well traveled, we see not only elements of the Gothic, but we see the use of decorative elements and technology that are part of the architecture in Turkey and Palestine. These kind of surface patterns of decoration. I know if you don't like architecture, you don't care, it's not interesting, but it's definitely something that is seen here in the Houses of Parliament. Pugin, as an advocate for the Gothic, it's no wonder that he would be a part of this Gothic revival. And his book, The True Principles of Christian Architecture, he's writing about how the Gothic is the first pure Christian architecture, that we're not looking to ancient Greek or ancient Roman temple structures where they worshiped gods and goddesses, that the Gothic was an expression of the Christian God, and therefore making the Houses of Parliament in this Gothic style was more true to the Christian English nation. You can visit the Houses of Parliament. You have to book tickets in advance, and you're only allowed in specific areas, but I encourage you to go. It's really cool. Also, many people are familiar with the Houses of Parliament because of its distinctive bell tower. Here, this image is showing you one of the houses. If you're not familiar, there are Houses of Lords and Houses of House of Commons and House of Lords. These are two branches of their parliament, and we're looking here at one of the houses. So that's why it's called Houses of Parliament, not just House of Parliament. It's because there's a parliament, the meeting of the lords and the meeting of the commoners. Back to this bell tower here. Many people identify London by this bell tower. The bell tower is misidentified often as Big Ben, but this diagram is here to help show you so that you can be super smart in front of your friends. The bell tower is technically the Elizabeth Tower, and the clock set into the tower is the Big Ben. So Big Ben is the clock, the tower is Elizabeth. So if ever, you just want to be like, hello, yeah, I'm just drinking my wine here, and I'm just going to tell you that actually Big Ben is the clock and the tower is the Elizabeth. You can thank me later.